Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I paint this green glass vase using watercolor. So this is the inspiration image and this will be the final painting. So while this is not a formal tutorial, I hope that this will give you a little bit of insight into my process in working with transparent color and building a watercolor through transparent glazes. So what I want to look for is some basic shapes, soft edges and hard edges, and highlights and shadows. Ultimately, I almost want to picture this painting as if it were in black and white. And if you're having difficulty seeing that and are distracted by the color, you can always just filter it or flip it into a black and white image on your computer or using a software app. And this will kind of isolate those shapes and patterns to help you easily identify lights, mediums, and darks. In this particular image, I've just used a filter to kind of create a poster-like quality to show you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different values. And hopefully this will help you to kind of navigate what appears to be a really complex map of shape and color. So I start with a basic sketch using a 2H pencil, and this just shows you some of the texture in the foliage of the lilacs, but here's a nice close-up look. You can even see, while I don't recommend shading in the stems, I have shaded them out temporarily because I know that they're going to be much darker and painted with darker pigments, so it's not a problem. I start by wetting the vase all over. I have not done any masking at this point. I'm applying a nice juicy layer of water. That way the paint just sort of floats on the surface and doesn't penetrate or stain the paper right away. I'm taking care to make sure that the handle of the brush is pointing inward and the tips of the bristles are pointing towards the edge. I'm using Hooker's Green Dark with a little bit of burnt umber, which just gives me a slightly more natural green. Now I'm just bringing in streaks of gamboge, which is a nice transparent yellow. I'm dropping in a little bit of phthalo blue, and now I'm just sort of spreading out the paint a little bit. And I'm using my 1-inch wash brush to lift some of that paint up. At this point, you can actually dry it up. I like using a hair dryer because that speeds the drying time and really helps to flatten out any buckling in the paper. My next step is to use masking fluid. In this case, I'm using Pebeo drawing gum. And you only want to use masking fluid on a dry surface and with a synthetic brush. I like to put a little bit of soap on my brush first to protect the bristles. So I wet my brush and soap my brush, and then I wipe a little bit of the excess soap off of the brush because I don't want to contaminate the masking fluid. And then I can safely dip into the masking fluid without introducing too much soap. Now I'm using a number 6, and what I want to do is just highlight some of the edges, anything that I want to protect that is in this existing foundational color, those initial washes that are nice and pale. I'm just kind of masking out any shapes that I want to preserve. So you can see the brightest areas of the vase here. I don't need to mask out the entire block of that sort of squarish shape in the middle of the highlight of the vase. I can just focus on the thinner lines. Basically anything that's a little too small to paint around when I go to paint my next layer of wash color. So I'm really just focusing on any tiny highlights in this first layer of color. Make sure that you're rinsing and checking your brush to make sure there's no masking fluid that's accumulating accidentally on the bristles. Make sure it's super duper clean once you've given a good firm jiggle in the water. And then you want to re-soap again, dip into your masking fluid, and start the whole process all over again. I'm continuing to work on this dry surface, just looking for highlights of the color that's already on the paper. There were not any pure white areas. Even though the eye might want to trick us into thinking that there were whites on this vase, there weren't any pure white areas. So that's why we wanted to do that initial wash. So I'm really playing with the quality of line here. Sometimes I'm using more of the belly of the brush. Other times I'm using the tip of the brush. You've got about a minute or so before you should rinse your brush and reapply the soap and go back into your masking fluid. You never want to leave masking fluid on there for too long. Now I'm moving to my fan brush. And the reason for this is we've got a little bit of texture to apply, and I love using my synthetic fan brush. Here I am flicking it against a skinny handle of another brush. And what we're doing here is creating some really pale little glass bubbles, and they might be water bubbles or they might be flaws in the glass, but that will kind of give me a really fun texture to work with. We're also going to let this dry. You never want to paint on top of wet masking fluid. Here I am working on a dry surface. Now this yellow looks a little bit dirty, but that's just because we've got that green brown underneath. And I'm using the gamboge here once again. I prefer it to cadmium yellow because it's a lot more transparent. And I'm just blocking in some basic shapes. Working on dry gives me nice hard edges. Working on wet gives you soft edges. This way you can control your shapes a little bit more and kind of work as if they're like little puzzle pieces. Now I'm dropping in that Hooker's Green Dark with a little bit of that burnt umber, and you can see where it hits the dry paper, it's nice and crisp. Where it hits the wet areas of the gamboge that are still active, it bleeds beautifully. Don't be shy to fully saturate these areas with color. Watercolor always dries a little bit lighter anyhow, so it's nice to kind of get that richer color in. Now, if I don't want the colors to mix together, then I won't stir them up on the surface together. I kind of just float them in and let them be. The more you stir it up, the more those two colors become a new third color. Here I am working with the Hooker's Green Dark mixture again, on dry, just kind of figuring out some of the shapes that I want to preserve. You can see with that more turquoisey tone, I've introduced some phthalo blue, working on dry, really getting some of the color of the glass showing up now. So this is what the image looks like thus far compared to the photo. Now, that lower section that I had been working on before is just at the point of being damp. What that means for me is that I can go in with a brush that just has water on it and actually open up some really cool blooms. So the water is kind of spreading that pigment and it's splitting it and creating these lovely blooms that give us very spontaneous and abstract shapes. After that, I'm just moving on to a more kind of earthy tone. I've got a bit of raw sienna on my brush. Again, this isn't meant to be a tutorial that you could follow along with as it's a little too fast-paced, but I hope it gives you a glimpse into some of the process and how efficiently you can work, especially when it's high speed. So here I am using the phthalo blue, and then I want to point out how absolutely gorgeous that kind of muddy, earthy yellow looks with that phthalo blue. The contrast of the chroma or the saturation of the phthalo blue is nice and crisp, and then it just, I think, is such a beautiful foil for that earthy gold color. I'm just going down to the bottom here and lifting out some of the now dry areas of the green and yellow colors along the edges. So I'm just lifting up some of the highlights using a flat synthetic brush. I'm using all of the brushes from my line of brushes. These white brushes, although they're not super duper to paint with, I use them for a lot of my special effects because of the firm nature of the bristles. So I've got a little bit of water on this square. This is my 1/2 inch. And because it's rigid, it actually lifts the pigment up beautifully. And you can do this on dry or damp. And I'm using a little bit of Kleenex to kind of blot that excess pigment away as it builds up. So I'm kind of scanning, and there I am blotting, scanning and looking for subtle highlights that, rather than masking and giving me super duper hard edges, the lifting kind of creates a nice soft edged shape or line. I can also use this lifting technique not just to lift out lines, but to lift out entire shapes to kind of soften them and take that hard edge off. Now that that's dry, I'm actually layering with a little bit of ultramarine blue, and this layering process is often referred to as glazing. So now I'm just kind of softening that edge and blending it in, but I needed that line to be sharp, so I was working on dry, and that's what a true glaze is usually all about, is working on dry with transparent color. So you can see, especially through that center, I wanted a nice highlight that's kind of softened and blurred. Now I'm going to be just adding a little bit more ultramarine and letting it bleed down some of those active areas. Here I'm bringing in some dioxazine violet. It's my favorite violet to work with. I think it's absolutely gorgeous and nice and neutral, and it's just like the perfect color because it's transparent. It glazes beautifully as well. And I'm working slightly into the damp area in that middle section of the vase, and then the lower section is dry. Now I'm bringing in some phthalo blue. You can see I'm not too concerned because this vase has so many beautiful and interesting abstract shapes. I'm actually not too concerned about the exactness of the forms. Now that it's dry, you can see that it's a little bit duller, and it's time to safely remove some of the masking fluid. So I'm just using my rubber cement pickup here. I'll have some links down below in the description for all of these tools and supplies that I'm using if you're interested. Just remove any of the little gunk or buildup of residue on the edges of the rubber cement pickup, because sometimes it will transfer some of the rubbed out pigment, which is kind of yucky and not something you can remove afterwards. I speak from experience. Now, I'm not removing all areas of masking fluid. There's some, like along the rim, that I want to keep intact. I'm going back to my firm, flat synthetic brush with water on it to just soften any edges that I feel are a little too harsh, and you can see how beautifully that lifts. It just sort of eradicates those hard lines. And I blot to get rid of any of that dirty, extra watery pigment that's being reactivated. So that just clears it away. Blotting with dry Kleenex, by the way. Anytime I want a softness with my color, I apply water to the paper surface first. So here I know that I want a nice soft blurry wash, so I'm wetting that dry area so that the paint can just float over top beautifully. So here I am going back to what is my Hooker's Green Dark. It doesn't have any of the brown in it, it's just Hooker's Green Dark. And because it's touching that wet area, it's just kind of blurring and streaking beautifully, as is this phthalo blue that I'm introducing now. So just keep flip-flopping between the green and the blue, just working on creating some nice saturated pigment variations in this upper portion. The paper's still wet, so I'm continuing on, just looking for areas that I can glaze with the phthalo blue. Now, as you recall, that lower section was dry, so the paint that I'm bringing in past the water line is going to be hitting a dry surface, and that's going to be giving me hard edge shapes. So it's kind of fun to be playing with the soft blurry shapes above the water line and then those really crisp shadowy shapes below the water line. Here I'm just working between the Hooker's Green Dark, the Phthalo Blue, and then the Gamboge. There's a little bit of violet under there, as you probably recall, and the ultramarine. So when the yellow hits the violet, it turns a little bit more brownish, and that's kind of a good thing. It'll give a much more natural result to some of the earthy tones reflecting in the glass. Now I'm jumping up to Hansa Yellow, which is another really gorgeous transparent yellow. It's a little bit more citrusy, a bit more acidic, so it pops, almost looks like a fluorescent yellow. Revisiting the lower section now, working on dry, I'm just using a little bit of sap green, has a bit of raw sienna in it. Now I'm just using a little bit of burnt umber and sap green, adding some texture to the branches themselves, making them a little bit more voluminous. Now I'm going back to the lifting just to lift out some of those hard edges and any softer highlights, as I explained earlier. Just because there's a shape in the photo or a shape in your actual image or subject matter in real life doesn't mean you have to love it in your painting. So always make sure that you are giving yourself the freedom to make those adjustments. I just didn't love the shape through, like it's almost directly in the middle of the vase. I suspect it's a silhouette of the photographer. And so I'm just removing that and changing the shape a little bit to make it more abstract. Bringing in a little bit more of an amber color now to the branches, and that will make it stand, or that will make them stand apart from the cool green tone. So a lot more of a reddish tone here. This is burnt umber and burnt sienna with a little bit of raw sienna. Now I'm introducing a bit of Prussian blue, which is kind of like a dark denim blue. You're probably getting used to me saying that it's a transparent color now. This is how I like to work. If you have any questions or are curious about transparent colors, you can visit my recent Instagram post all about transparent colors. If you have any questions about color, or you're unsure or feel a little bit insecure about color mixing, you can download my color charts. That's an option, and it's super affordable. It has every recipe basically that I've used since the dawn of time, and takes kind of the guesswork out of it for you. So you can click one of the links and it'll take you right to those beautiful little recipe templates. Working on dry, just finishing up some of the harder edges and lines and shapes within the stems. Loving some of these darker, richer browns and dark army greens. I still have the masking fluid, as you can see, so that's been allowing me to paint freely around them and not have to worry or slow down, and because I know they're nice and safe and preserved under there. So here we are before the masking fluid has been removed and before any final touch-ups. And here is the final piece entitled Enchanted. It is an 18 by 18 inch watercolor on cold pressed paper, and you can find it on my website or just shoot me an email if you have any questions about it.
Friends, I would really be grateful if you liked this video and subscribe to my channel. This helps me to continue creating free content for viewers like you. You can also follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Crystal Beshara Artist. If you'd like to dive a little deeper into your artistic journey with me, all of my full-length video tutorials are available through my website at crystalbeshara.com/shopvideos. Each video has written prompts as well as real-time footage, techniques, and pro tips. They also come with a downloadable printable kit with a complete list of materials, reference images, and the art lessons are yours to keep, and you can stream or download to watch anywhere, anytime. All of these links are listed below in the description. By subscribing to my newsletter, you receive 15% off my line of brushes. You'll be among the first to know about promotions, shows, tutorials, inspiring blog entries, and workshops either at my home studio near you or abroad. Thanks again for watching, and see you in the next time.